This is Neil Hamilton, 30-something years at Drake Agricultural Law Center. He's publishing like crazy, and he's got a garden. It's one of our best allies for those of us who care about the environment. So we're really honored to have you, sir.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And I may go ahead and stay seated here because it makes it, I think, easier for Christine and the Zoom folks.
Yeah.
And you can all see me. And I do have to thank Mike and Chris and Christine and the whole crew with the Raccoon River Watershed Association. Some of you were here a year ago. In fact, looking at the crowd, looks like I think 80% of you were here a year ago. But my book, The Land Remains, had just come out. In fact, I think this was the very first event where I actually had copies and sold a few. And so here we are a year later and 40+ events and talks and interviews and 2,500 copies later. It's been a great experience. And the big news, as I'll tell you about here in a few minutes, I've got the companion book, The River Knows, which will be out in hopefully in about 6 weeks. And so, well, you know, and many of you have heard me talk before, and so I went back through and I threw out some slides and put in a few new ones, and some of this may be familiar to some of you, but hopefully not. But I think, as you know, we each have a story. The land has a story. You could each write your story, right? In many ways, Ray and his wife have shared their story through their love of birds and the photos that we just saw. And The Land Remains, in many ways, is a story about, in part about my life and the farm I grew up on in Adams County, but also about Iowa's land and our attitudes towards it and our future. And farming has changed, I think, as I like to say, that header on that combine probably costs more than all the equipment my mom and dad farmed with over a couple of generations. But the land remains and resilient. And for those of you who read The Land Remains, this is the back 40. This is the field out in the middle of our section 13 that in fact narrates the book. And the land's resilient. It's going to outlive all of us. And in many ways, the way we leave it is a portrait of ourselves. And I think you've heard some great ideas this morning from Tom and from Ray, and you will from Jim too, about how our actions can help leave it perhaps better than it may have been when we acquired it. You know, and we have a rich legacy of conservation leadership in our state, and a history of it, and people like Vin Darley, of course, one of my heroes and fans, and other people, and you certainly know Henry Wallace, and maybe you've heard me talk about John Fletcher Lacey, but if you haven't, you know, John Lacey was a congressman from Oskaloosa, one of the most powerful conservation leaders in America at the turn of the last century, author of the Lacey Acts that deal with the movement of, they were the first game protection laws passed at the federal level, helped deal with the plume wars, used his background as a railroad lawyer as the nation was looking for how to deal with the movement of illegally harvested plume birds out of Florida to the East Coast for the millinery trade. And he said, well, we could use the Interstate Commerce Clause, just like we regulate railroads. And so we passed a law that made it illegal to move in interstate commerce birds that had been harvested illegally in the states where they were in fact slaughtered, and that began that effort. But he's famous today, in fact, for some things in the news almost every week. The Antiquities Act, right? When President Biden or when President Obama created Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante in Utah, and intervening president tried to wind them back, and President Biden has actually restored them. That Antiquities Act, right, was written in 2007, and it was authored by Lacey, in large part for his friend Teddy Roosevelt. He used it 18 times in the next year, and protected things that today we can't imagine that we wouldn't have a Grand Canyon, right, National Park or Mesa Verde, but those began as national monuments. The law gives the president the unilateral power to withdraw land from the federal reserve for protecting its scientific and historic and scenic values. And so others like Ada Hayden and Aldo Leopold, and Jim could probably tell us some more about Ada Hayden since he's with the Friends of the Ada Hayden Park near Ames. But Leopold, of course, one of his most famous writings, and hopefully you've read Leopold and have a copy of San County Almanac in your library. I know I gave away hundreds of copies of the book to my students, and Leopold, of course, talked about our relationship to the land and the land writ large, right, in the form of an ethical structure. And he was an incredible writer, but one of his metaphors that I find most powerful is this one about when logic history calls out for bread and we hand out a stone, we're at great pains to describe how much the stone resembles bread. And we're big on stones, not as big on bread, perhaps, right? When we think about our relationship. And so, right, a system that values economics, one that doesn't teach much in the way of ethical obligations, political system that was conservation based primarily on economic self-interest, which we've taken to the third degree today with our conservation programs, many of them. But it's an important opportunity. And, and I spent my career dealing in many ways with the stone, which was our legal system, right? That's one of the things that we're good at. And it has an important role to play, right? But regulations aren't quite the same thing as what Leopold was talking about. And I'll give you an example. You think of wetlands, or you maybe think of the prairies that Tom was talking about earlier. And, a Leopoldian land ethic would have it such that if you owned the wetland, right, the wetland really had its own right to continue to exist, right? It was there when you bought it, and you didn't necessarily have the right to destroy it, though that's certainly our attitude, or many of our attitude. But our legal system, well, we could pass something like Swamp Buster that says you can't drain it and be in the farm programs, or Section 404, the Clean Water Act that says you need a dredge and fill permit from the Army Corps if you're under clean water jurisdiction, or even the Iowa law on wetland protection. But then, of course, the lawyers would begin, well, how did you define wetland, right? And what did you mean by hydric soils and hydrophytic vegetation, right? And how big did it need to be? And what if it was already a farmed wetland, or if it was prior converted? Right, we begin to kind of look for the ways around it. So Iowa's wetland protection law, the separate one, only applies if they're larger than 3 acres and doesn't apply in drainage districts, right? And so if you have land that's wetland, but it's in the jurisdiction of a drainage district, it's not really protected under Iowa's wetland protection law, right? So it has a little bit of a Swiss cheese quality to it. But Wallace wrote about this issue, right? The lesson that we're slow to learn. He wrote this in 38. We're still learning it slowly, but individually, which is one of the ways that you find hope. And I think you look around this room, most of you folks embody this lesson. Ding drew what Wallace knew, right? Here's one of Ding's great images with Mother Nature with her kettle of fertile soil that it's the only kettle she's got. And there's some of that soil we love so much, right? This was on the Bill Riley bike trail down on the Raccoon after one of the floods. One of my Dallas County constituents needs to come down and get their farm back. And there's another one of Ding's images, right? He didn't have that question, but I did, right? Are we mining our soil just to grow more corn? And anybody that's looked at the changing pattern of our land use certainly knows that's the truth. And the person down the corner is saying, well, all the money in the world, but nothing to do, no food, and no place to go, right? And there's a good one if you want to trigger a discussion, right? The food or fuel issue. Many people would like to say that it's resolved, but as I like to say, most of us were around back in the late 70s when we started putting ethanol or alcohol in gasoline, and you had the sticker with the corn cob on the gas pump and said, oh my gosh, great news, this contains 10% alcohol from corn. And I don't think many of us could have stood on a pop can and looked 40 years down the road and thought we'd be taking 60% of Iowa's corn crop and grinding it up to burn it in our cars, right? As opposed to using it for what I think maybe its moral purpose. But, so the book, there are a number of lessons from it. And, these are all things that we can think about. I'd like to remind us that we're all landowners, right? Whether your name's on a deed or not, your name's on the deed of millions of acres of land. And in Iowa, right, hundreds of thousands of acres of land and all of the parks and all of the rivers, right, that we have. And so you're never very far from property. And then property has two components, right? The private side, which we spend a lot of time talking about, not as much about the public side, right? But yet all land only, the right to land only exists because we have an ordered society that actually respects and protects property rights. And so you don't have to be out, right, defending your borders of your property, right? Your deeds recorded with the county recorder, and our system recognizes and supports those. But at the same time, there are other public components to it. Zoning laws, environmental laws, right, are really a form of a restraint on private property. And if you don't think your private property has a public component to it, try not paying your property taxes for a while and see what can happen to you. And if you read the book, you know about the story about our farm and how my grandmother, when she died, made the decision to treat her children fairly, not necessarily equally, and left half of the farm to my father, who had come back to Iowa with her to farm it in the 30s from having grown up in Southern California, and the other half to the other 5 siblings with a requirement they sell their shares to him. And that didn't go down well, as you might imagine, but it's what really, right, preserved the farm as a farm and what I think rewarded him for having done something fairly unusual. It was kind of a reverse Jodes, really. They came back to Iowa in the 30s from California. But there are other things, right? And the river talks about some of these same things too. And so we'll save some of these. We're recognizing the lies we tell ourselves and the myths that we hold dear about how we treat the land is an important part of, I think, our individual and maybe collective reckoning with where we are with the land. And there are other issues as well, some more controversial than others. There's a large chapter, if you've read the book, about land and discrimination and the questions of who had the opportunity and who didn't to buy it. And we don't necessarily like to think of it that way, but one of the quotes that I used at the beginning of the book is by James Baldwin. It says that people who believe that history flatters them are like a butterfly impaled on a pin, unable to move or to change. Like I like to say, I mean, history began when we showed up, right? Began in the 1870s when my ancestors blew into Adams County, right? We don't think much about who was here before. We didn't learn much about who was here before. And we don't even think that much about how it was we ended up with it, other than to know we're pretty glad we did, right? But we also don't think about who didn't end up with it, right? Or who wasn't at the table when the cards were dealt. So there are things that we can do, and certainly the work of land trusts like INHF, which I've had the great honor of being on the board for 30-some years, is an example of that. So taking responsibility for our land, and all of you who know anything about soil conservation recognize that that's an ephemeral gully. And what a wonderful turn of phrase for such a tragic episode, right? That those markings on the land will be gone the next time you come over it with a field pass of some type. USDA doesn't even count the amount of soil that moves in ephemeral gullies when they're calculating soil loss, but they exist. And it's kind of nature's way of telling you where you might want to think about a waterway, but that would be difficult. So the river knows, right? That's the next book, the kind of the companion. The river has a story, and as I say here, and in fact, one of the devices that I used in The Land Remains was to have it narrated by the back 40. And, that as a writer, it's kind of a tricky question, right? Because you wonder whether people are going to think this is just some type of first-class gimmick, or whether it could actually work. And I've been heartened that a number of folks who've read it said that, right, it certainly helped them think about it. And so in The River Knows, the narrator is a friend of all of yours, right? It's the Raccoon River, gets to tell part of the story. And as I described the book's a little hotter than The Land Remains, because the river has a different history than the land does. Rivers do a number of things, right? They offer us enjoyment. My gosh, you know, the whitewater courses we're putting in, things like Trout Run Trail up at Decorah. They offer us adventure. And these folks don't pay me, at least yet. But if you haven't been on the riverboat, you know, on the riverboat Twilight out of LeClaire and done that little 2-day trip, a day up to Dubuque, 80 some miles, you stay in the hotel, then you get back on, you come back down. I did it last October. It was one of the most fun vacations I've had in a long time, right? And you spend an hour on the Mississippi, and you get a feeling for how incredibly important that river is to our nation's commerce, right? And what an artery it is, as well as the beauty of what's involved. And that's the owner and the captain of the boat, and it's an interesting thing. But they also suffer some insults, and Ray, you'll recognize that picture, right? The cattle in the stream is one of the photos that you sent me. I think those tile outlets are down on our farm in Adams County. And there's some more insults, right? This was on the Upper Iowa near Heritage Valley, and I'm sure they were glad they got that last rural corn combine, right, before the banks left off. And there's a good legal question here too, right? Because Iowa, under, right, the law that made the waters of the state the public's, owns, right, the water in the rivers, and, right, depending on how you read it, they also own the banks, right? Well, so where's the bank? Well, here apparently it's moving, right? And so, right, the whole question under the public trust doctrine, which unfortunately the Supreme Court turned its backside to a couple years ago in a lawsuit that was brought to protect the raccoon. Right, the public trust doctrine would have helped us determine exactly how far back from the water does the public interest go, right? I mean, currently the legal question is, oh my gosh, Iowa couldn't pass a law that mandated some type of buffer requirement along rivers and streams because that would be, right, a taking of private property, which it wouldn't be constitutionally, no more than taking your side yard under a municipal zoning law isn't a taking, right? You still have economic use of the majority of the property. But politically, it's certainly a tougher calculation. But determining that, in fact, the public has a public trust over how, right, the waters next to the rivers and streams are used would be a different critter. And they can test our ethics, right? There's, I just came back from, I'm on the board of Seed Savers up in Decorah. A couple of years ago, we sold the DNR and easement over several miles of the trout streams that run through Twin Valleys Farms. And those are the signage that you see. But then a few miles away on one of the tributaries of the Upper Iowa, you know, here's a sign in which, you know, the owners had allowed anglers to use the property, but they were closing it because of how it had been abused, right? As to that. And there's a riverbank collapsing into the channel. And, you know, so I want to talk a little bit about water quality, if that's okay. I hope you might be interested in a little bit about water quality. You know, and one of the questions is, and some of you were at Plymouth Church a couple of weeks ago may have heard some of this, but you know, the issue is, will water quality ever get better in Iowa? And I think the simple answer to that is probably not. Not if you're looking at it from a collective meta standpoint. There's no reason to think we're going to grow fewer acres of corn, or we're going to raise, right, fewer pigs, or that we're going to handle our nutrients much differently. But that doesn't mean that it can't get better where you live, right? Or what's coming off of your property, or what's flowing through your community. I think there's a real localization issue that may be involved here. But some other things, right? We have to get serious about it. Recognize that the nutrient reduction strategy, which we're
I think maybe there's a cake at lunch, right? We're all supposed to be celebrating his 10th anniversary. Right, but I think we need to recognize that it's largely an exercise in magical thinking. Right, there's no reason to assume a law that requires no one to do anything, which is what it does, right? Because it's entirely voluntary, is actually going to ever move the needle very far. And we can count practices and make outlandish claims about 2.8 million acres of cover crops, which apparently are hiding mostly in the back 40s, if they exist, right? But if you don't count the other things that are happening, like the thousands of miles of additional tile that we put in every year, right? And all of the other things that are happening. I mean, the reality is, at least if you believe experts and data, which it's not clear everyone in the state does, but if you do, our nitrates have probably increased by about half, right, in the time that the nutrient reduction strategy's been in place. But, and so we have to drop the myths that we tell about our efforts, quit lying to the public. We need a lot more truth tellers than happy talkers. Boy, we've got legions of happy talkers who can tell you about what a great job we're doing, and we just need more time, right? Or more money, or maybe both. And we certainly don't need regulation. Truth tellers have a relatively fragile lifespan in Iowa from a public standpoint, as the story that many of you know about Chris Jones and what's happened in recent weeks would tell us. We have to recognize the forces that are driving our problems, our love affair with corn, our desire for more ethanol all the time. And there's nothing inherently wrong with ethanol, I think you can say. But if there's problems with where or how you're raising corn, then a push for more ethanol just exacerbates your corn-related problems, right? So whether that's soil erosion or water quality or nutrient use. The increase in our livestock numbers, that's kind of one of the real hidden issues, I think, that doesn't get the attention that it should. Maybe that was one of the reasons Chris paid some of the price that he has paid, at least in terms of his relationship with the University of Iowa. One of his most powerful commentaries was Iowa's real population, right? Where he identified that once you measure the human equivalent of the manure produced by the millions of animals we have, instead of having a population of 3 million, we have a population closer to 168 million, so that we have the density of about Bangladesh, right? And the North Raccoon has a population equivalent of Tokyo. And almost all of the waste of which isn't treated in any particular way, right? But some of it, just a little bit, right, may actually find its way into the waters. So, right, there are things we can do. We need to give the local governments the tools. A number of us here, Soil and Water Conservation District commissioners, and could expand at length on what an impotent, uncared for process that is, unfortunately. But it could change, and there are great examples of counties that are doing wonderful things, like Polk County, Howard County, where they walk every mile of every stream every year, and they have 55% of their crop ground in cover crops, right? In a county that you wouldn't necessarily pick out as being the high point of local conservation. We have to embrace watershed citizenship, and this is a theory of mine, right? We all love being citizens, and we know what it means and the responsibility that it means. And watershed citizenship, right, and thinking about the duty and relation we have to everybody else in our watershed. And one of our problems, right, with the way we think about water is the moral hazard that's involved, right? I mean, if your assumption is that, well, whatever came out of my tile outlet or came off of my front yard and goes into the water is somebody else's problem to take care of downstream, right? Which is, right, if you haven't at least thought about it or done what you could to perhaps minimize it, that's the effect of your action. And so in many ways, that's a moral hazard, right? You're pushing your costs onto somebody else. That was what was at heart when Bill Stowe and the waterworks finally got tired and no one upstream being willing to take responsibility for what they were doing to the river, to say, okay, why don't we see whether we can find a legal hook to hang our hat on? And the moral hazard part's compounded in that it's a public water, right? I mean, it's our water. It's not just the neighbor's water, right? It's our water that's being affected by all of these behaviors. And so in many ways, our legal system really encourages and sanitizes immoral behavior, right? In terms of how we think about our water resources. So we need to set some priorities, some timelines. We need to modify the nutrient reduction strategy, maybe a strategy 2.0 that actually has a strategy in it, right? That sets some goals and some timelines and priorities as to where we're going to use the money, right? And measures it so that we know whether we're making progress, right? We don't just count the checks, but we also count the costs that happen. And I think, right, that, there's the saying that if you're shaped like a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so if you spent your life working with the law, then you think of things in a legal sense. But regulations are a key part of life, right? The width of the door you came in, the height of these tables, the car you drive, right? There isn't a component of our society that we don't use regulations to establish expected standards of performance and care and safety. And so why would we have an agricultural system that says there's no role for regulations, right? And it will never use a regulatory approach to address how people would use water or land, right? We don't do that for any other part of the economy or society. And so at some point, right, the sell-by date of that no role for regulation mantra, I think, is going to wear thin. Though it's like the milk, apparently you can drink it a little bit longer if you can hold your nose. But one of the problems with the not having any expected, right, performance is that when Polk County or soil conservationists go out and talk to a landowner and say, Ray, you ought to think about buffer strips or maybe going into the CREP wetland program or putting some continuous CRP prairie strips on your property. And you can say, well, no, I don't think I will, right? I mean, you don't have to do anything, right? And so you always start with zero in terms of having to convince them to do it. Well, how much do I need to pay you to do it, right? What would be the flexibility would be involved? Think how different the conversation would be if you went to Ray and said, okay, Ray, you realize you need to do something, right? You got to take some responsibility for your water. Here's some things you can choose from. Which ones do you like to do, right? Which ones would work best on your property? So that we don't start from zero, right? With the opportunity for people to say, not today, right? Because if you ask most, I think, farmers and landowners, say, what have you done affirmatively to improve water quality or to protect your land? The answer for a fair number of people would be, I haven't gotten around to that part yet, right? To some extent, the good news is that Iowa State surveys show that there are 40% of farmers who say they haven't heard about or are unfamiliar with the nutrient reduction strategy. How's that possible after 10 years, right, of spending millions of dollars of promoting it, right? Anyway, I digress, but not much. Oh, there's some cows cooling off in the stream. That picture, if you've been to the Eagle Cam and the fish hatchery in Decorah, that's about a half-mile west on the bike trail, right? You go west, you go around the corner and turn south. There's a dairy farm perched right next to the creek. We have to integrate our efforts of water quality and almost everything we're talking about. Prairie reconstruction, creating bird habitat. And we need to think about it as an integrated system rather than kind of a one-off. And we need to get everybody involved. There are a lot of people sitting on the sidelines. The ag retailers are a good example. But there's some peace and solitude on the North Raccoon. That's a stretch between Dawson and Perry. Sportsman's Park. Yeah, Sportsman Park. Ray knows where that is. Well, there's some things that the river knows, right? This coming to this book. And, the river knows a lot of stories too. And I don't know where we are time-wise because like any good professor, you wind me up, I can go for a while. But, if you read The Land Remained and you like some of the history and the stories that are in there, there's some stories in the river book too, right? The river tells the story about the Oleo Wars, right? some of you may remember the Oleo Wars, but you would have been tykes because it happened in 43. But the Oleo Wars were when an Iowa State graduate student working in the Ag Econ department had the audacity to issue a government-funded publication that said Oleo was as nutritious as butter, right? And the dairy industry and the Farm Bureau went ballistic and demanded the president of Iowa State fire all the professors involved and pull the publication. And it became a big national news story because it was a academic freedom issue at a real cow college. And before it was done, Ted Schultz and half the econ staff left Iowa State. Of course, Ted Schultz didn't have much of a career other than going to Chicago and establishing the Chicago School of Economics and winning the Nobel Prize. You know, you certainly wouldn't have wanted to keep him right at a school that was developing a reputation for independent social science research. So there's the Oleo Wars, and the river asked the question, what are the Oleo Wars that aren't being fought today, right? Who's raising the question of, are we too infatuated with ethanol? Or do we have too many pigs in too few places? Or is the lesson from the Oleo Wars, keep your head down and your nose clean and hope nobody gives you a problem? It also tells a wonderful convoluted, lengthy story about the Des Moines River land grants, and that involves the Raccoon River. In fact, it involves Raccoon Flats, but I'll leave that maybe for the question period. So, well, we need clear thinking, a better plan. We're confused. You know, we say we love the land, but it's not clear we do. At least our actions don't show it. All of it, right? Of course, in this room, I'm talking not just to the choir, but many of the choir directors. You know, we need to stop fooling ourselves. The river knows it has friends. There's Mike and Ty, and Mike went out tire shopping one day when we were on the Raccoon and found one, and hopefully it fit the truck when he got home, but he fished that out of a sandbar and didn't capsize in the process. The river knows some other things, right? We don't like to set limits. We don't say no very often. And when it comes to agriculture, we almost never say no, right? In terms of what you can plow up, what you can plant, where you can plant it. And so that's why we need those standards of stewardship. And we need to use the opportunities to address climate change. And we need to welcome some more people. And this is that regenerative agriculture that Tom was talking about. And, you know, unfortunately, many of our institutions that should be the friends of the river are at least hamstrung currently. You know, the river has a long memory, right? And so, you know, it's easy to become depressed thinking, oh my God, you know, we're in a world of hurt and it's never going to get better. Well, maybe, but pendulums swing and society's attitudes swing. And the DNR's maybe not always going to be perhaps complacent, and maybe the soil and water conservation districts will get funding to do things. But at the same time, certainly the local governments are doing a fair amount. Polk County, where we are, is a perfect example, right? A $65 million bond issue approved by 82% of the general population, right? The last land and water vote on top of the $50 million one that had been passed 6 or 7 years before. The use of ARPA money, right? Polk County Board of Supervisors putting at least $16 million into ARPA funds into water quality initiatives, such as a batch and build wetland program. So there's some exciting things happening. But the river knows we need more big ideas. And I'm building up to a rock'em sock'em finish here in a minute. So we need more imagination. We need bigger ideas. We might as well go back and actually complete some of the ideas that were big that I mean, the REAP program. All of you have been involved at some point, at some place in a REAP project, right? Or you've been benefited by REAP project. I mean, this graph over here, this came from 2017. We had 13,000 plus projects that had been funded by REAP, right? And that's 5 or 6 years ago. 300 and some million dollars. The part of the story that doesn't tell is we've never funded REAP at the $20 million that it was authorized at. We've short funded the REAP program by close to $300 million in the roughly 30 years that's been in existence. It got funded this year at 12, and $1 million of that was pulled for, state park maintenance. And so should it surprise us, we haven't increased the sales tax to fund the I Will program, right? The Natural Resources Trust Fund. We didn't even fund the REAP program, right? Which it'd be hard to find somebody who would object to what's happened in the REAP program, other than the fact they didn't get funding, right? Because there wasn't enough funding to go around, right? When everybody applies and you have all these great programs. So, and the Icon Water Trail, right? I'm involved with it, and Icon's a big $120 million plus project. Work started on the Scott Avenue Dam, right? Breakthrough. The interesting thing about Scott Avenue, if you've ever been down there and driven by it, you've seen a lot of people fishing. The DNR says that is the #1 most popular fishing spot in the state of Iowa in terms of the number of people who fish there. The Scott Avenue Dam, right, by the ballpark. And so this new project's going to maintain the fishing opportunities there, but this is a good one. And this one has that, right, there's that chicken and egg quality about it, because some people say, oh my God, why do you want to put more people in the water? Maybe Jim's going to talk about this. The water can be pretty dangerous, and so maybe we need to clean up the water first. Well, okay, maybe our grandkids will get around then to working on putting people in the water. Or alternatively, say, well, maybe if we put a few more people in the water, and then they encountered water that said, my God, they say I maybe shouldn't be in it this week. Then maybe a few more people say, well, what's going on with the water, right? Why can't we do a better job of cleaning it up? And the business community, which for many of these issues, unfortunately stays on the sidelines, maybe more than they should. For people that like to yak about how quality of life is so important to attracting employees and retaining employees, right? And you got to make Iowa a place they want to live. You would think the business community might try to swing a bigger bat when it came to things like fighting Senator Sweeney's anti-public lands bill that the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and the rest of the conservation crowd had to fight off this last session. Successfully, at least for now. We need a Lowe's Hills Trail. Oh my God, Tom showed that wonderful slide of the Lowe's Hills with that, put the line in there and the percent of prairie that's there, largely because people couldn't get to it, right, to do something to it. And a lot of that prairie on the western slope, those goat prairies, right? And think if we had a trail that ran from Wabansie, right, the Wabansi's down there, you're looking over across the plains in Nebraska, and ran all the way Murray Hill. This is in Harrison County. That's the Murray Hill overlook. If you've never been there, it's a really unusual geological formation. And there's Brent Trail that the county has created, and it went all the way north to Stone State Park. Right, and so you had Sylvan Runkle, and you had the Lowe's Hills Forest, and you got the Hitchcock, and you got the Wabansie. We got all these pearls on the necklace already, right? I think if you had a 250-mile linear trail system, kind of Iowa's version of the Appalachian Trail, that you could walk and enjoy those Lowe's Hills, wouldn't that be something? I mean, isn't that a big idea that we could get our heads around? There's a Facebook group for a Low-High Trail if you want to go on Facebook. And see what they're doing. There's a big hike coming up at the end of the month. I think it's already full, but so that's a big idea. And here's a big idea I've been involved with promoting since last November when I cooked it up. It was this idea of a nature summit, right? As I spent the last several years out traveling around the state and writing these books and talking to people, it strikes me, how rich our community of nature-based and natural resource organizations are, right? And the number of people like yourselves that are interested in these issues. But yet at the same time, at least from a policy and an advocacy standpoint, we're kind of back on our heels, waiting for the next bad idea to come out of the legislature, right? In terms of who's going to take funding or who's going to limit the ability to do things. And so my thought was, well, why don't we try to get all these folks together, right? At least from an advocacy standpoint, and think about what Iowa could do, right? And how we could have more collaboration and cooperation and communication. And some people said, well, gee, that's just talking to the choir. And well, maybe it is, but how often have we ever gotten the choir together? Right? In terms of, everybody, you can find something on this logo, right? That you do, birds or insects or prairies or rivers or paddling or hiking or gardening, right? They're all up there, but they all involve nature, right? And they all involve, right, kind of elevating nature to being the central part of the foundation that underpins this. And this isn't just about, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had some place to go out and play, right, or to recreate? Because instead, collectively, nature is really, right, if we're going to have a future, right, if we're going to deal with climate change and issues that threaten us, nature's going to be the basis upon which we do it, right? And so let's have a nature summit, and lots of groups have been involved, and this is a little dated. There are 50+ organizations involved, and the website's going to go live soon. And I've got a couple of handouts for folks that are interested, or if your organizations haven't had a chance to join on yet. The Thursday evening of it, we're going to have an awards dinner in which we're going to recognize a number of Iowa's nature champions. And we're fortunate to have 2 of them with us today. Tom Rosberg, Jim Pease are going to be recognized, along with Connie Mutel, Marlene Ayersman, Mark Ackelson, and Larry Stone, right? All folks that have played a critical role through their careers of helping Iowans think about nature and what we can do. So, well, my gosh, never got to honor Bill Stone and remember the things that he did. And never stop fighting for cleaner water. I think the river would agree with that. And I love this one. Well, what if we do all these things, right? And there's this guy down in the audience, he's sitting homeward towards the back, says, well, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, right? Well, we're all about trying to create a better world. So I'd like to end with little girls and kitties, because they were all hoping for a better world. And with that, I'll be quiet and turn the rest of my time back over to the good of the cause. Mike?
Yeah, we're gonna do lunch at 12 o'clock, so we've got a few minutes.
I want to ask Tom Rosberg 2 questions. Tom, are you still here? Oops. He's busy talking to Neil Flora.
Yeah.
Jan? Okay, can I ask him 2 questions? Because okay, Tom, I'm asking you 2 questions. Yeah, I know you are, but I'm going to ask you 2 questions because I think they probably came to people's minds. So when you say, right, that the studies say we have 30,000 acres, right, a prairie that we hadn't converted, but then as you were out, right, as you were showing the Los Hills and southern Iowa, it seemed to me, did you come up with the idea that maybe that number's a little low and there's really, it is low, right?
A lot of that invisible prairie in southern Iowa, that we refer to, is not counted or hasn't been counted.
Sure.
I think, yes, the Los Hills have probably been a little bit off for that.
So here's the second question I want to ask too, because I mean, many of you are involved in prairie restorations, right? And you showed all those different prairies, and some of them are reconstructions are relatively small, but collectively they're not. Earlier this week, I was up in Cedar Falls and stopped and visited the Tallgrass Prairie Center with Laura Jackson and what they're doing at Iowa, at UNI with this prairie seed research. And my gosh, the integrated roadside management program that they run. And so I guess my other question is, what's our current number of acres of prairie, right? Does the Iowa Prairie Network say, well, geez, we're back up to 200,000 acres now with all the prairies that we've restored or recreated, right? So do we have a good number on that?
Well, there was a student at Iowa State quite a while back. He contacted me, who was at least was talking about doing a project, I think for a master's degree, in which he or she was going to try to estimate the amount of reconstruction that's been going on, and maybe even try to get some kind of assessment of it or something, but
Okay.
I don't know if that ever came to fruition.
But so you don't have a number off the top of your head and say, well, we had 30, but in fact, by my count, I can identify
Well,
85,000 acres that we've tried to restore and recreate in the last decade.
I've tried to come up with that, so in my section in County's land, I did try to estimate my conservation land,
Yeah,
which includes all public and private land that has conservation value, so reconstructions are included. But I also added up, which is, I added up all the forest land and wetland,
Sure.
and public reserve land, conservation reserve land.
well, the point I'm getting at, I think that it would be an interesting number if we could say, well, you know what? Whichever number you want to start with, we estimate that we destroyed most of it down to X. But now in recent, years, Iowans have been able to triple that number through their actions. Is it enough? No, that's not the point. But is it evidence that in fact we can make a difference? Yes, right? In terms of what we've been able to do. Because, your number, conservation lands, that includes all of the CRP.
Conservation land includes any kind of
Sure.
conservation land, from forest land, woodland, even again, some of these pasture.
Sure. But within the CRP, right, you've got the CRP 25 and the CRP 42 that were actually prairie CRP, programs. And somebody, I would think the NRCS could tell us the number of that. Okay, here's how many acres are enrolled in those two programs. So anyway.
That's what I did, I used MRCS data, I used contact a lot of people who, at least I could give you some idea of how much CRP land there is, perhaps. Wetland reserve, IHF.
Sure.
How much land that PNC and IHF has in easements, which are private land.
Yeah.
Again, has.
It's about 25,000 acres.
I didn't try to separate out by ecosystem type.
Sure.
I don't know how much it's prairie or wetland, just what the total.
Okay. Well, Mike, I'm sorry I used up all the question and answer time, so nobody can ask me a question, but hold it.
Five is actually the INHF polls. right?
Yeah.
But there are lots of counties.
Oh, yeah.
Additional.
Yeah.
Those figures change almost daily.
I'm just thinking of this nature summit in November. It'd be helpful between now and then that we, identify somebody or commission some work so that we could have kind of a better snapshot of being able to say, well, this is where we are, right? We've restored this many prairie, we have this type of acre that we're making, kind of the good news story, right? There are ways that we're putting things back in the positive side of the account. So, questions? Doesn't look like anybody has any time for lunch. What?
I like the idea, maybe we think, with regard to water, and that we can make progress.
Well, in that regard, and Tom, maybe you can answer this after lunch too, is, you said what we need to do is to go out and make sure we've identified and protected all the remnants.
Right.
Is there anybody doing that?
Not well enough.
Yeah, I mean, but if you're thinking of like kind of the type of activities that the DNR or that the county conservation, that somebody could do, well, what if we had some type of assertive campaign? We're going to go out and try to identify all those remnants that are still there, right? Let's not lose any more.
Private land.
On private land,
There
yeah.
was that guy, Neil, that was going county by county, an Irishman, Finnegan or something like that. That was.
Dan Fenimore,
Fenimore.
he did surveys in central Iowa. I don't know how much he got off of the roadsides. I know it was mainly focused, I think, on roadside survey type, but that's after life.
Yeah. Where's his data? Does Drake have his data or does anybody?
No, Drake doesn't have data.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing.
We have at least one real question right here. I mean, not that yours wasn't, a civilian.
Visual signage from the very, like, sign.
We could get a sign that says run the park.
Okay. And then the other thing is, I'm doing an oxbow restoration on my farm in Clark County, and I'm wondering if that is just gonna be under the wetland. vision that you have, or Oxbow, they're a whole separate,
Is that is that a NRCS or an IDOLS?
it's a combo
Ox-
of
okay.
NRCS and then IOS.
Yeah.
They don't.
I don't know what they have in terms of signage for Oxbow. Part of it depends on where, oh, oh.
That's all under the wetland. I mean, it's a creek.
Jay, yeah, you realize, I don't know, you know, you'd like to think there's somebody keeping score, right? I mean, in terms of the DNR or somebody, you know, is tracking these things, right? So that you could report some things. You would hope that our collective lesson around water quality isn't that, well, don't monitor and don't count it because it's a bad story, right? And we just as soon don't know, right? It seems to me there are a number of good stories here that would be helpful for us to potentially know. And ones that were a little bit more ground truth than the 2.8 million acres of cover crops, which was a small sample done by ag retailers of a select group of customers who estimated whether or not maybe there were cover crops in their area. Right? And you take that little database and then you pump it full of air and you blow it out and you say, oh my God, we got 2.8 million acres worth of cover crops, you know, where the high resolution photos don't show anything to that extent. But, you know, people don't scratch very much further to say, well, where do those numbers come from exactly, right? I mean, who is it that's gilding this lily? But anyway, Mike, we ready to eat? Oh, Deborah's got a question in the back. Oh, we got another 5 minutes, and then Ben Stone down front. Deborah? Which is?
And we have carbon pipeline petition on the table. He came up and said, why do you guys not support that? And I said, well, explain eminent domain for private gain. And he said, you don't understand. Ethanol is the future of ours.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, one of the reasons you want to buy the river book is for the Des Moines River land grant story that explains to you why ethanol is like a steamboat and railroads are like electric vehicles. And CO2 pipelines are like trying to improve navigation on the Des Moines. Right, I'll give it in a snapshot. In 1846, before Iowa became a state, Congress, right, gave the state alternating mile sections in a 5-mile swath on both sides of the Des Moines River from its mouth to Raccoon Flats. About 300,000 acres, right, that the federal government was going to reserve out of the General Land Office, grant over to the state of Iowa. They could then sell them $1.25 an acre minimum, and they were going to use the roughly $400,000 to pay for improvements on the Des Moines, right? And so they hired some people and they started trying to improve the Des Moines, right? And there was going to be a canal and some locks, right, as you got up towards Bentonsport. Okay. A year later, after Iowa became a state, then the General Land Office sent the state a letter and said there's a question that's come up about the land grant, and which in fact provides the state alternating sections for 5 miles on both sides of the river to the extent of the river in the state, which meant it now ran from Des Moines all the way to the Minnesota border, which meant that the state just got another 900,000 acres given to them free from the federal government, right? Oh, you know, hallelujah, right? If you're the state, because now you got more land, right? Because they're already contracting for more money than they had, right? And so there was an issue of good faith and credit. Well, of course, a year later, a new land commissioner, new secretary of treasurer sent the state a letter and said, no. The original grant only ran to Raccoon Flats. You don't get an extra 900,000 acres. And believe it or not, over the next 10 years, that decision was reversed 12 times, right?
every time there was a new administration, they'd say, okay, yes, you do, you have the 900,000 acres, right? President Polk could die, somebody else came in, no, you don't, right? And all during this time, though, the general land office is selling land next to the river, right? And the issue of whether or not it's reserved the state's land, which are the alternating sections, right, became a problem, okay? So after Congress finally in 61 said, yes, the state gets the 900,000, issues continue to go up to the Supreme Court for the next 40 years over conflicts between settlers who bought land from the federal government and the banking company essentially that took over from the bankrupt River Navigation Improvement Corporation trying to reclaim the land, saying, no, that was the state of Iowa's land. The feds actually gave Iowa an additional 300,000 acres to try to make up for the mess, right? But it didn't necessarily make up for all of the problems with the settlers. So how's this story relate to today? Well, by the early 50s, railroads had come into being. Nobody was improving navigation on the Des Moines, right? And so the whole idea of why the land grant even happened disappeared. And we, of course, gave the railroads generous land grants, okay? And so the parallel again today is, so here you've got ethanol, right? Which goes into gas-powered cars, and you had steamboats, but steamboats were replaced by railroads, a much more versatile, low-cost, efficient form of transportation. You can make the argument that electric vehicles are going to replace much of the demand for fuel-based vehicles, right? And so in this parallel, right, the steamboats, right, are essentially, right, like the ethanol plants, and the grant to improve navigation on the river is like the CO2 pipeline, the only purpose of which is to try to prolong the life of ethanol, right? I mean, that's the whole, right? They don't even pretend that it somehow is improving the climate, right? In terms of the amount of carbon being sequestered. It's all, of course, built on top of public subsidies. The renewable fuel standards, the regulation, the idea of a low carbon fuel rating is regulatory based, as is the whole idea of the T45 tax credits you get for building it. No market-based, right, support for either of those three pillars of that system. But that's the future of Iowa, apparently, right? Boy, and if that's the future of Iowa, whoa, maybe we ought to be looking for some other things to do in our future, right? Maybe we should be thinking about doing other things with some of these cornfields, like the type of things Tom's talking about with 30 by 30, right? And a transition to more, or other things that we could be doing with corn, or maybe not raising quite as much corn, right? If Liz Garce was here, she'd say the thing you ought to be doing is drinking more beer and whiskey, right? So that we had more demand for rye and barley and small grains and the other things that we can grow right on Iowa's land. We didn't used to grow this much corn, right? It's not like we have to, but it's certainly easy.
Why did we grow hemp?
Yeah, well, the hemp story is become kind of a hinky story too, in terms of what the demand for hemp is, but we grow some, but hemp's almost like the Jerusalem artichokes from 40 years ago, right? We've had this constant search for some type of third crop, or the aronia berries, right? That some folks maybe got into a few years ago. We keep chasing our tail. Why don't we go ahead and put pastures back and grow cattle, for God's sake, right? That's what grassland's good for, right? It's not that we don't eat beef, right? So why did we tear up all these pastures and tear out all these fences and all these watering systems, right? We could restore a beef cow herd in the state. And then if the cattlemen are sitting there, they say, well, that's part of the problem with the CRP, right? How can I compete for pasture ground if somebody can put that crop ground, instead of putting it back into grass, I can put it in the CRP for $300 an acre. So anyway, we need an integrated system all done all through.
Speaking of beef, we have beef.
There you go. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris. Oh, and I have some postcards
for The River Knows, right? You can pre-order it from Ice Cube Press if you want to, or you can wait and review it on Amazon so that I actually have some positive reviews, right? If you go on Amazon and you look at the river, at the land remains, somebody bought this book a year ago and wrote this really scathing review that said, if you're a conservative, this book's not for you. I'm amazed how much he hates conservatives, but it shouldn't surprise me. He was at Drake. And I'm going, what the hell's that got to do with anything? But anyway, so, and so that's the 1-star review that shows up on Amazon, right? But there are a bunch of 4 and 5. So anyway, thank you.
So did you talk about the nature summit?
Didn't even mention. Yes,
Oh.
no, I did. I talked about it. Yeah, no, I did.
Okay. All right, well, you have the dates on that, so on that handout I had, so you want to be sure and talk some more, talk that up, look for that, watch for this book. If you've read the book, get out there and review it. And